I must confess that I don't think very often I preach from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew Scriptures. And if you think about the way that we choose Scriptures for any particular Sunday, number one, we're often shaped by the lectionary. As you know, the Bible is divided into Sundays, and each Sunday there are particular Scriptures that are assigned. And there might be 3 or 4, and we might end up preaching primarily on one. And whether we would choose one from the Hebrew Scriptures or not is another question. And I sort of feel like in our tradition we pull some pieces from that wisdom, from that literature, but that we have a much kind of broader understanding and awareness of the Christian Scriptures. Because we've had Rabbi Stephen Pierce with us over the last month, we made a commitment, the worship team, to preach on the Old Testament each of these Sundays. And so it's been interesting to look at what is there and to make some choices that aren't necessarily controlled by the choices in the lectionary, but just to cast about. A couple of weeks ago, David, I'm blanking on his name, Vasquez Levy, who's the president of PSR, preached on a story about Elijah. And in the process of telling that story, I had to look back at the stories that happened before that to kind of understand the context for that. If you remember the story, Elijah was kind of in trouble. He was running from the people in power, and it was because he was kind of in trouble with them, with the people in power, because of what he had done in the story before, which we didn't hear at that point. But there was good reason that he was on the run. And so as I thought about this weekend and preaching, I wanted to look back at what that story was, and it's one of those stories. It's kind of an incredible and amazing story. It's one of those stories that you think, what are we supposed to make of this? And this is part of our tradition. It's something for us to look at, to deal with in progressive Christianity. We have some freedom to see what's there and what's not, what we grab hold of, what we might set aside because of the historical context or whatever. But this morning we're going to look at the story before, what happened to Elijah. One of the other things that happens with Scripture is that we're often looking at a tiny bit of it, and in this particular case, it's kind of helpful to see what happens over the arc of this story. So we have the part of the story where Elijah is on the run, and he's actually helped by God to survive and to carry on and to make it to the Mount of God. But part of the story before is that Ahab was the king, and Jezebel was the queen. Now, we hear that word Jezebel in a lot of contexts. I'm not sure that people really know very much about who she was, but she was a Phoenician. And Ahab was the king of part of what is now Israel. The land was divided into 2 parts. And Ahab was the king of part of it. And if you look through 1 Kings, there are these little stories about the succession of kings who seem to get in greater and greater trouble with God because of what they do and the way they use the power and what happens during their reign. But there are mostly these short little stories. But Ahab takes on the power of the throne, and he marries Jezebel, which we can probably assume was partly a marriage to consolidate power with part of this territory of Israel and with the Phoenicians. But Jezebel, when she came into the court, brought with her her gods and her prophets, the prophets of Baal and Ashereth. Now, we're not going to go into the whole thing about where these traditions came from, but so much of the story in the Bible has to do with this kind of competition between the one true God and not only the gods who were worshipped by the people, but the relationship between the worship of those gods and the people in power. So it says in the story that Jezebel had like 450 prophets of Ashereth and 400 prophets of Baal. That is a lot of prophets. I mean, if you just think about it, mostly when I think about the prophets, I think there's one lonely guy crying out to God. And yet here's this story that starts with this idea that there are 850 prophets. Now, it's probably better to think of them more as priests or religious leaders, but still, it's a lot of prophets. And there's something about this story that is grand in scale. And so there's this kind of tug of war between Jezebel and her religious tradition and the Hebrew people. And at one point, Jezebel has kind of banished, if not killed, some of the Hebrew prophets. And there are a whole bunch of them. Some of them are now hiding in caves, being fed by actually someone who's in the court, who is a faithful person who's protecting some of these folks. So there's this struggle going on, and Elijah is right in the middle of this as one of the primary prophets, one of the primary Hebrew prophets. So as the story goes, Elijah suggests a kind of giant test of whose God really has the power. And this is what Elijah says: I want you to gather all the people of Israel and all the prophets of Baal and all the prophets of Asherah. So remember how many prophets that is. That's 850 prophets. And presumably a whole lot of other people. I'm imagining enough people to fill a large stadium. A lot of people around. And he says, we're going to build 2 sacrificial fires. We're going to build the fires. We're going to have the cattle that we're going to butcher and offer as the sacred offering. And we're going to see which of our gods will get the fire lit. So the prophets of Baal, they build their fire. They bring in their ox, they butcher the ox, presumably right there on the spot. They put it on the logs, and they start to dance around the fire, calling on their gods to start the fire. And you can imagine, the fire does not start. No matter how much they call out to their gods, they even do sacrificial cutting and spill their own blood trying to get this to happen, but nothing happens. Elijah starts to make fun of them and their gods. Where are your gods now? But the fire doesn't start. And so Elijah builds his fire, and he piles up the wood, and he butchers the ox, which is another amazing part of this story. Here's this prophet having to butcher his own ox to create the sacrifice. I told you it was grand in scale. Don't ask me to do this sort of thing as a religious leader. So he's got the fire, and he's got the ox, but that isn't enough. He says, dig a trench all the way around the fire, and then go and fetch some water, and douse the fire and the ox and the whole area with water. And not just once, but 3 times. He has water brought in, the water is poured all over the fire, the water is starting to fill up this trench that they've built around the fire. What self-respecting Boy Scout would even imagine that a fire could start in a situation like that? And you have to remember, there are 850 prophets of Baal hanging around. There's this whole crowd of the people of Israel. They've been waiting all morning for a fire to start. And here's Elijah dousing the whole fire with water. This is not the kind of spectacle the people were expecting. And yet, Elijah prays to God. He lifts up his arms and said, God, I call on you to show these people who you are, that you are the one true God. And there is a bolt of fire or something that comes from the sky. It consumes the whole fire and the oxen and all the water surrounding it. Just imagine that for a minute. Just imagine what it would take in that moment for something to happen that would consume all of that. This soggy wood, this soggy cut up ox, this trench full of water. What would it take? What kind of power would it take for something like that to happen? I can't even imagine. And yet the fire started, it consumed everything. And then Elijah orders the people who have gathered to slay all the prophets of Baal, which they do. That is why Elijah was in trouble. That was why he was on the run. He had made his statement. He had proved his point. And then he had taken action. What are we to make of this story, especially that last part? That question was raised by one of our congregation members after David preached, because she knew what had happened in the story before. And it's a fair question, which is, I think, one of the reasons that as progressive Christians, we dance our way around the Hebrew Scriptures. And yet, this story has something to say to us. Because are we not now still in competitions around whose God is the true God? Is this story past? No. Are we going to have some sort of sacrificial bake-off in order to solve this problem? No. But this is a situation that still exists. We are still in a situation where we're saying, my God is better than your God is not the true God, and you may suffer violence and even death if you disagree. This describes not an event that happened, 2,500 years ago. This describes a current reality. Now, whether that is our question as progressive Christians, actually I don't think it is. I see no reason for our gods to compete. And I think a progressive Christian point of view would be to look at the power, this power that we recognize, this magical, mysterious power that exists in the world, that many people might find many ways to describe it and understand it. And yet, it's often the politics underneath it that gets us into trouble. It's not the mystery. It's that somehow who is in power and what gods they ascribe that to is such a challenge for us in the world today. What if it's as simple as this, that as we look at this story, perhaps we realize that we're not thinking big enough about what we asked from God. This was a big thing that Elijah asked. We would never do that. We would never kind of expect that something like that could happen. But what does it mean? What would it mean for us if we said, our God is a mighty God? We can call on that power. God, we need you to solve the problem of racism. God, we need you to solve the problem of war. God, we need you to solve the problem of poverty. This is nothing smaller than a sacrificial fire that you're trying to light when the wood is wet. And yet, perhaps it's possible. I don't expect a ball of fire from God to come down and solve our problems. But I am going to open up myself to the possibility that I might expect that of God, that I might ask that of God, that I might believe that God is that powerful. And what would it mean for each and every one of us if we understood that God might be able to light a fire in the soggiest parts of ourselves. This too is possible because God is great and God is good. Amen.